Hi class, welcome to chapter 13, Nutrients that Support Blood Health and Immunity. I did slightly shorten this chapter and cut out a few parts just because it was so long, and I felt that some of the things covered were more for a biology or anatomy type class versus a nutrition class. So I hope you don't mind. Okay, so this very first slide is looking at blood cells. And the key to this first slide is way over here on the right and up here on the left. And so the key is that you can see that there are many vitamins and minerals involved in the formation of our cells. And we have about 100 trillion cells in our body, all of which play a vital role in keeping us alive. And so without vitamins or minerals, we would not be able to form many of these cells. Red blood cells. So red blood cells are the most prevalent type of blood cell that we have, and they contain hemoglobin, which has a heme group. The heme group has an iron in it, and because of that iron, it's able to bind oxygen and transport oxygen to our body. We have white blood cells, otherwise known as leukocytes. We have platelets, which are not actually cells, but they play a very important role in blood clotting, along with calcium and vitamin K. And we have plasma. Plasma is kind of the liquid extracellular part of the cells. Hemostasis. So hemostasis means stopping or preventing blood loss and balancing our body's blood levels. We don't make enough blood that we can afford to lose a ton of it. So this is very important. Our body does this through two mechanisms: by vasoconstriction, which is constricting the blood vessels and limiting the blood flow, and formation of a blood clot. And there are vitamins, minerals, and hormones involved in all of these processes. Forming a blood clot. So forming a blood clot is a multi-step process, and we'll see some diagrams coming up. But what happens is, say you get a wound or you cut yourself, with a knife when you're chopping some veggies or something, that damaged tissue sends a trigger to your brain and a cascade of reactions follow, and calcium and vitamin K are very important. This slide shows calcium and vitamin K in the blood clotting process. And here's calcium, here's vitamin K, and here's inactive clotting factors and active clotting factors. So you actually need these to activate your clotting factors, and the clotting factors turn something called prothrombin into thrombin, which converts fibrinogen to fibrin. Fibrin is insoluble, and this is the basis for a blood clot, and then calcium molecules also are involved in this blood clot process as well. So if you did not have calcium or vitamin K, our blood would not be able to clot, and the result would be hemorrhage, the opposite of homeostasis. This is when blood loss can't be controlled, and this can put the vital organs at risk. Diet-wise, this could happen if you don't have enough vitamin K, because we just saw that vitamin K is essential to the blood clotting process, or if you had too much vitamin E or too many omega-3s. Both the vitamin E and omega-3s can interrupt the blood clotting process and slow down the blood clotting process. Vitamin E can interfere with vitamin K. So we've just talked about vitamin K, we've talked about calcium a little bit. Other vitamins and minerals that play a role in the blood are B6, B12, vitamin C, iron, and copper. And so we're going to talk about each of these coming up. But let's talk more about vitamin K first. So we discussed that vitamin K is key for blood clotting. Another important role of vitamin K is for bone health. You actually need vitamin K to help build your bones. Vitamin K has 3 different forms. One is called phyloquinone. This is the most abundant form of vitamin K, and it's made by green plants. And then we have menaquinone, which is actually made by some of our gut bacteria. And we have menadione, which is a synthetic form that is found in supplements. This is a diagram looking at sources of vitamin K, and you can see most of these sources here are in green. And so vitamin K mostly comes from vegetables, but you also do see some oils because this is a fat-soluble vitamin. So mostly these green leafy vegetables and green-colored vegetables. Vitamin K recommendations. So this is a fat-soluble vitamin, but this is one of the fat-soluble vitamins that we actually do not store a lot of, and we use quite a lot of it. So it is possible to have a deficiency in this, and toxicity is less common because we don't store it that much. The only concern we have with vitamin K is if you're eating a lot of vitamin K or taking a vitamin K supplement and taking an anticoagulant medication. Anticoagulant medications are medications to reduce blood clotting. And an example is, sorry, I'm not writing very good. Coumadin is an example. And warfarin is another example, warfarin. And these medications are often given to patients who have had heart attacks or strokes to reduce their further risk of heart attack or stroke. However, if somebody's on these medications, it's very important that they eat a consistent amount of vitamin K because otherwise those medications won't work as effectively. What about anemia? So what is anemia? Anemia can be caused for many, many different reasons, but the end result is that you don't have enough capability to carry oxygen through your blood. And this could be you don't have enough red blood cells. Those red blood cells are irregular. Those red blood cells can't carry oxygen, etc. And the signs of anemia don't feel very good. So you feel tired, you might have shortness of breath, you might physically look pale, you might have difficulty concentrating, you could be cold, you just won't feel very good at all. Some of the causes are listed here, and then micronutrient deficiencies can also contribute. So these vitamins we're going to specifically talk about as far as their role in blood cell production and the ability of the blood cells to carry oxygen. Another very important part of red blood cells. So folate. Folate is crucial for DNA synthesis. And in folate deficiency, the cells can make protein, but they can't make DNA. And so they do grow large. However, they're not complete. So they're considered immature. When it's time for the cells to divide as they're growing, the amount of DNA isn't enough to form 2 nuclei. And so they stay in this kind of large immature state and they become what's called a megaloblast. So they're big cells, but they still just have this 1 nuclei because they didn't have enough DNA to make 2 nuclei. So this is a megaloblast cell right here, and this is a normal cell. And this can happen due to folate or B12 deficiency. Folate deficiency, like we just saw, will cause a megaloblastic anemia. This is large, I thought something was going to come up there. This is large, immature blood cells. It can also cause neural tube defects, which I believe we've seen pictures of already, but this happens while the baby's developing in the womb. Adequate levels may help protect against cancer. However, this is a little bit of a tricky subject because once somebody actually has cancer, having high folate levels can actually make it worse. And there are cancer drugs that actually reduce folate's action. So cancer is a little bit of a tricky one. And then adequate levels also help with neurotransmitters in the brain. Sources of folate. So folate comes from the Latin word folium, which means foliage. So again, you see the green leafy veggies as being a really, really good source of this nutrient. You also see some legumes here, you see some grains here, and a little bit of orange juice. Orange juice is sometimes fortified, as well as may have some natural folate. Recommendations. So unfortunately, food processing destroys folate, and this can be due to heat, high heat, or exposure to oxygen. In the orange juice, the vitamin C that's in the orange juice is actually really good because that actually helps protect the folate from oxidative damage. So, what can you do? You could maybe eat raw fruits and veggies, or you could eat fruits and veggies that have been freshly washed, freshly cut, and cooked at low heat, cooked at dry heat. That could help. In 1998, because they recognized many people weren't getting enough folate, they started fortifying grains with folate. And so all grains, for example, those we find in breakfast cereals and breakfast bars and breads, are fortified with folate. The RDA is 400 or 600 if pregnant. Pregnant women need more for the developing fetus. And synthetic folate, meaning from a supplement, is more bioavailable than a food source of folate. They measure folic acid in dietary folate equivalents. And so when you take a supplement, you actually have to take less of it versus getting folate from real foods because you can absorb more of that supplement. Vitamin B12. So B12 is a water-soluble vitamin, but it is unique as far as water-soluble vitamins go, and it can be stored in the liver. We find B12 in animal sources. However, we can also find B12 in fortified foods or nutritional yeast, or take supplements. And the absorption is pretty complex. So usually when we find somebody being deficient in B12, it's not because they weren't eating enough, unless potentially it was a vegan. It's usually because they weren't absorbing it. And elderly can be at risk for reduced absorption due to changes in their GI tracts. There's many possible reasons why somebody would be at risk for absorption. When we eat B12 from foods, it's called protein bound. And so we actually have to separate the B12 from protein using the hydrochloric acid in our stomachs. After we separate it from the protein, it then has to bind to something called intrinsic factor in order to be absorbed. And so if somebody is lacking intrinsic factor, then B12 can't become absorbed through the small intestine. If you are low in B12, there are some deficiencies that can result. B12 and folate are very related. You just saw that they were both involved in synthesis of cells. And what else does B12 do? It's important for the nerves. It helps maintain the myelin sheath that insulates the neurons. And in a B12 deficiency, you could have impaired reflexes or even death. Something called pernicious anemia can develop, which is a macrocytic anemia. What this means is the cells are big, just like you saw with the folate deficiency. And this can lead to many, many symptoms such as paralysis, depression, pain, and weakness. And the word pernicious itself actually means leading to death. Back when they first discovered this, they found this in a population of people who were eating large doses of raw liver. And because, they treated this by giving people large doses of raw liver. And because the liver is such a good source of B12, it was able to help reduce symptoms of this disease. Usually, like I said, people develop these deficiency symptoms not because they're not eating enough, but because potentially they can't absorb it. So why would they not be able to absorb it? I mentioned before that you have to separate B12 from protein and you need stomach acid to do that. So if you have low stomach acid for any particular reason, that can inhibit that step. Also, certain medications such as metformin, which is given for diabetes treatment, may reduce B12 absorption. And then vegetarian or vegan mamas who breastfeed are not going to have B12 unless they're taking a supplement. And so they won't be able to pass B12 to their baby unless they're taking a supplement. Sources of B12. So here you see they're mostly coming from protein foods as well as dairy, but you do see some in Cheerios, and that is a fortified source. Elderly adults over 50 are encouraged to look for a synthetic form of vitamin B12. And the reason for this is the synthetic form of B12 is not, you don't need hydrochloric acid to separate it from the protein. And so if they are low in hydrochloric acid due to some GI condition, they can still absorb the supplement form of B12. You can also get B12 injections if you want it to bypass your gastrointestinal tract and be sure that it's absorbed. Like I said, most adults eat enough. However, sometimes there's problem with absorption, and you can store enough for quite a few years. They actually estimate that some of these deficiency symptoms, like the neurology issues, don't develop for even 20 years without eating a B12 source. However, it's still recommended for vegans to supplement or find foods that are natural sources of them, such as nutritional yeasts. Nutritional yeasts produce B12, but also are fortified with B12. Iron. So iron is a really, really big one for our entire body, but especially with the blood. And this is the most common deficiency worldwide. It's expected, or it's noted that about 30% of the population is anemic, and about half of these, so about 15%, is caused specifically by iron deficiency. Iron is really important. It helps form the heme part of hemoglobin, and the heme molecule is what carries the oxygen, so we can get oxygen to our tissues. Iron's needed for brain function. It helps with detoxification in the liver, and it helps with synthesis, can't say that, of collagen that's really vital for bone health. We can't store enough iron, and so it's important that we are eating iron on a pretty regular basis. We can store some, but we can't store an endless amount. Iron deficiency, very, very common in young children and during puberty as well as times of growth, because they have higher iron needs since they are growing new cells, increasing their blood volume, increasing their muscle mass, etc. And they have little tiny stomachs and sometimes low appetites, so it's hard for them to get enough. Women, where, or maybe I should say when, do we lose iron? Women tend to lose iron during their menstrual cycle through menstruation every month. Men tend to lose iron through ulcers, stomach ulcers that might be bleeding, or through colon cancer, or through hemorrhoids that could also be bleeding, so more lower GI stuff. Pregnancy is a time where you need more iron than usual, because you have to provide enough iron for yourself as well as the developing baby. And women who are pregnant often have iron deficiency anemia because their blood volume has expanded so much and perhaps they're not keeping up with their iron needs. Athletes are also at risk for iron deficiency anemia. One, because they're more likely to have losses of iron in the blood, actually sometimes GI bleeding. And two, athletes, especially runners, can actually have lysis or breaking of red blood cells where the cells split open and then iron is lost and they need new iron to regenerate the heme. Supplementation. So supplementation is the only cure for iron deficiency, or eating iron-based foods if the deficiency wasn't that severe. You can give oral or IV based iron, and they recommend minimum of a month for either. And the most important thing would be finding the cause of the deficiency. So is somebody not eating enough? Are they bleeding? Do they have an ulcer? Are they malabsorbing, etc.? I have taken iron supplements in the past as prescribed to me by my doctor, and I've also had to have injections of iron due to iron deficiency anemia. And I was very surprised because I was eating iron-rich foods, and I was eating meats and veggies and vitamin C-rich foods. And I, didn't have crazy heavy periods or anything like that, but I was an athlete and I was running a lot. And I think that that might have been one of the main causes for it. Iron absorption. So iron absorption changes depending on what type of food you're eating, as well as your iron status in your body. If you are iron deficient or have low iron levels, you will absorb more from foods. If you have adequate or high levels of iron, you will absorb less from foods. And then the type of food matters. So there's something called heme iron, which comes from animal foods. And this is about 40% of the iron that occurs in, 60% of the iron that occurs in meat, fish, and poultry. And sometimes they call meat, fish, and poultry MFP factor. And the heme iron is important because you absorb it in a decently high amount, and there's not things that affect its absorption. Non-heme iron, however, the absorption is much less. And this is because certain things such as phytates in foods and other food composition can affect absorption. And so we're going to see this on the next page. Okay, how to improve absorption. So taking vitamin C or eating vitamin C rich foods can increase your absorption of iron. Also, an acidic environment. So if you're eating foods that are kind of acidic, that helps keep iron in a form that you can digest it very easily. So that can help. Meat, fish, and poultry, the MFP factor, that's going to have the heme iron, which is absorbed at a high percentile. And then things that can reduce iron absorption, something called tannins in tea. They can lower absorption up to 60%. Because of this, it's recommended not to drink tea with your meals, but instead to drink tea between them so that when you eat your meals, you can hopefully absorb some of that iron. Herbal teas that don't actually have tea leaves don't have this same effect. So it's tea with the tea leaves. There's something called oxalates, which are found in spinach, rhubarb, and chard. And then there's phytates, which are found in whole grains, bran, and soy. And these can reduce iron absorption. The problem with these two things is that these generally come from very healthy foods, and these are sometimes high in vegetarian diets. And so sometimes vegetarians have kind of doubly low iron absorption. One, because they are not eating this, and two, because they are eating things like this, which can impair absorption. Additional things that can impair absorption: megadoses of zinc, calcium, or copper. These have the same charge as iron and so can compete for absorption in the body. Food sources of iron, you see a lot of protein foods, you see some vegetables, parsley. I don't know who eats cups and cups of parsley. It's usually a garnish, but you could. Baked potato and artichoke are also some sources. Okay, so what amount of iron should we take? For this particular nutrient, women need more than men, and that's because women generally have greater losses during their menstrual cycle. Men don't have that menstrual cycle. And there's different recommendations for pregnancy as well as after menopause when the woman is no longer menstruating. There is an upper limit for iron, and this is because iron in high amounts is actually a pro-oxidant. We've talked a lot about antioxidants, but iron can do the opposite thing. And iron can cause GI inflammation, inflammation of your gastrointestinal tract, and can actually cause some diarrhea if taken in very high amounts. Problems with too much iron. So this is a big problem in children, and iron toxicity in children is one of the #1 accidental causes in death in children. And the problem with this is because sometimes children will see adults' vitamin supplements and think that they look like candy and eat a bunch of them. I know we're guilty of this. We have a gummy vitamin, and my child sees it and he wants to eat it. He thinks they're candy. So we have to keep them, high up on a shelf, locked up. Additional reasons why somebody might have too much iron. There's something called hereditary hemochromatosis, and this person has a genetic condition where they will absorb too much iron, and they'll get this from foods and supplements. And so this person can have liver issues and heart issues, as well as pancreatic issues and muscle issues, and they may be prone for infections and cardiovascular disease. Next, so copper. Copper functions as a cofactor for many antioxidants. One of them is called superoxide dismutase. And in our bodies, copper is found in our brains, our liver, our heart, our kidneys, and our muscles. It plays a role in the electron transport chain. It helps with iron transport. It's important for nerve myelination, the myelin sheath, that's the protective sheath surrounding nerve cells. It's important for neurotransmitter synthesis, immune function, and lipoprotein metabolism. So for example, LDL and HDL and VLDL. Low levels of iron can lead to anemia, low levels of white blood cells, which are our immune factors, bone loss, poor growth, and cardiovascular disease. Sources of iron. So liver, legumes, seeds, whole grains, cereals are all pretty high in iron. And milk and dairy are not that high in, talking about copper, not iron, copper. Milk and dairy are not that high in copper, and so they're not very good sources. However, cocoa is, and so that's why you see chocolate milk down here on the sheet. Form of copper in supplements is easily absorbed, and the food sources of copper, Okay. Food sources of copper are easily absorbed. Supplement form is okay, however, the absorption is not as good. Recommendations. So most people do get enough copper through their diets. And who might be at risk? Somebody potentially who has undergone intestinal surgery, because then they won't be absorbing as much copper. People who take excess zinc, because zinc has the same charge as copper and it can compete for absorption. Anyone who's had like stomach surgery or duodenum surgery. And there is an upper limit for copper, but this generally comes from supplement sources, not foods. And this can lead to gastrointestinal distress, liver disease, kidney disease, vomiting, etc. There is also copper found in some agricultural chemicals, so in agricultural sprays and pesticides. So it's possible that if you're not directly ingesting copper, but you're using those products a lot, you could be exposed to high levels of copper. Okay, so we've talked about blood, and now we're going to talk a little bit about immune function, and we're going to talk about bone as well. So our immune system. Our immune system is very, very complex, very, very functional, very helpful. It's a collection of tissues that work together to prevent infection. It includes multiple organs, as well as the lymphatic system and the bone marrow and the gut and the skin. And the skin and the GI tract provide both physical and chemical barriers to pathogens. the skin. So the skin is our largest component of the immune system, and the skin is almost impermeable to bacteria and pathogens as long as the skin integrity is maintained. If people have poor skin health due to rashes or wounds or allergic reactions, or maybe nervous conditions where they pick at their nails or, scratch their skin, or due to essential fatty acid deficiencies or vitamin A deficiencies or niacin deficiency or zinc deficiency, their skin won't be as effective of a barrier, and they could be at risk for different bacteria or viruses getting in through their skin. Intestinal cells are a huge barrier for us as well. There's something called gut-associated lymph tissue, and this is abbreviated GALT, and this is a very protective tissue that helps us keep track of pathogens and fight pathogens in our GI tract. Our microbiome plays a big role in the GI tract, and having healthy colonies of bacteria to fight off unhealthy pathogenic bacteria such as E. coli or Clostridium difficile. And then the actual physical structure of the GI tract is important. Cells should be packed closely together. This helps form a barrier. There are conditions where people have what's called leaky gut syndrome, and that's where components of the GI tract, such as the stool or the feces, or even some of the bacteria in there, can leak out through the intestines into the rest of the body, and that can be very harmful. Other components of our white blood cells, or our immune system, are white blood cells. And white blood cells are very, very important. There are many types of them. This particular type shown here is a phagocyte, and this site acts by... Okay, so this particular one is called a phagocyte, and this is a type of white blood cell that can ingest other bacteria, viruses, or fungi. This is nutrients that support immune function. And there's actually a really, really good table in your book listing all of the nutrients and exactly what they do. We are going to talk about most of them coming up, but there's descriptions for vitamin A, B6, B12, C, vitamin D, vitamin E, folate, zinc, iron, copper, and selenium. So there's really good tables in your book about this. Forming new cells, proteins, B vitamins, and iron are really important for forming new cells. And specifically, immune cells are cells that turn over rapidly because we're always having to make new antibodies to different antigens. We're always having to make new white blood cells to help fight off infections. Additional things that are important for immune cell formation are folate, B6, B12, and iron. Zinc and copper. So zinc and copper are both implicated in making our white blood cells, and their zinc specifically is important for a process in which enzymes are needed to destroy pathogens. So it helps with the white blood cells destroying the pathogens. Vitamin D helps with the immune system as well. Vitamin D can promote expression of certain proteins that are involved in destroying pathogens. And vitamin C has been studied a lot. Vitamin C, unfortunately, doesn't prevent us from getting colds, but it can slow down the time and the symptoms that we feel from those colds. And then vitamin E and selenium can work as antioxidants. So vitamin A. Vitamin A is stored in the liver and the adipose. About 90% of it is in the liver, and the remaining 10% is in the fat cells, the adipose cells. It's a collection of compounds called retinoids, and retinol, retinal, and retinoic acid are all considered preformed vitamin A. Beta-carotene is a carotenoid, and beta-carotene from foods can be converted to vitamin A in our bodies. What are the functions of vitamin A? They help maintain epithelial cells, and epithelial cells line the surface of lungs, intestines, the stomach, the GI tract, the reproductive tract, etc. help with T cell formation, help in vision. We're going to talk about night vision specifically, and are very vital to growth and development. So this is a diagram of vitamin A's role in vision. And what happens is when we see light, so in the light, we've got this over here, or in a light room, for example, there is something called the retina, and the retina is the back of the eye, and light will enter the back of the eye, and the retina consists of rods, cones, and nerve cells. And rods can detect black and white and help us with night vision. Cones help us with color vision, and both the rods and cones need retinol and vitamin A for functioning. Retinal, so retinal with an A. Is this on here anywhere? Let me write this. So retinal. So what form of vitamin A is important for vision? It is retinal, just like the retina of the eye. So retinal is very important to these rods and cones and helps our eyes adjust to dim light. Without adequate vitamin A, we can't adjust to dim light as well. In cases of severe vitamin A deficiency, something called xerophalemia can occur, and it's spelled kind of like what it sounds like. So xerophalemia. And this happens when the eye can become very dry, mucus production slows down, and then this dry eye is prone to becoming scratched and infected by different things. And if it gets really bad, something like this can happen, which is called a Bitot spot, and this is accumulation of dead cells on the outside of the eye. Vitamin A deficiency is a big problem. About 1/3 of children suffer from vitamin A deficiency worldwide, and this is the leading cause of preventable blindness. On top of blindness, vitamin A deficiency also severely influences the immune system. And so blindness is usually just the first part of a very sad disease that results from vitamin A deficiency. Because of this, there have been many interventions to try to increase vitamin A intakes across the world, and they have supplemented foods that are commonly consumed and easily accessed, for example, sugar and margarine and MSG. They've also genetically engineered some rice that they've called golden rice, and it has carotenoid pigments in it so that we can make vitamin A from it. They also encourage breastfeeding because vitamin A can be passed from mama to baby if she's breastfeeding, and then moms can be supplemented with vitamin A. Functions of vitamin A specific to reproduction and development. So helps with protein synthesis, helps with bone formation, is crucial to sperm formation, and children who are deficient in vitamin A could not only have blindness, but weakened immune systems and stunted growth. Sources of vitamin A. Vitamin A is found in quite a different variety of foods. So it's found in liver, it's where it's stored. It's found in sweet potato, spinach, some fruits, margarine if it's fortified, cheddar cheese, milk. It's found in quite a few different things. It is possible to have toxicity of vitamin A, which is when you have too much vitamin A, and usually this would happen when you are having vitamin A from supplement sources. However, it is possible that it could come from food sources, and where they've seen this toxicity is in populations that eat liver. And eat a lot of liver. Some animal sources of liver are just so loaded in vitamin A that they can actually lead to toxicity. In developing babies, where they see this happen is sometimes if women are taking a supplement that's very high in vitamin A, or certain acne medications do contain vitamin A and are strictly contraindicated in pregnancy. And so anyone who's pregnant should consult their doctor immediately regarding their acne medication if it is one containing vitamin A. Zinc. So, zinc deficiency, this was first recognized in the 1960s in Egypt and Iran, so that really was not that long ago. And what they saw is growth retardation and poor sexual development. And this was easier to see in men or young boys versus women. But what happened is literally they looked like boys instead of men. So this is a 16-year-old boy, and he is almost, he's just under 4 feet tall. So he's very, very short. His growth was stunted. And what happened is parts of the soils there were very low in zinc, as well as parasitic infections increased zinc losses, as well as people would eat diets that were high in phytic acid, which could bind zinc. Zinc has many, many, many important functions. So it's required in over 200 enzymes. It helps with DNA synthesis and function, wound healing, protein metabolism. It also helps with eye health, slowing the risk of macular degeneration. And it can be important for the skin and cell structure. Sources of zinc. Most people do get enough zinc, and we don't usually see zinc deficiency in healthy adults. However, sometimes we see it in low socioeconomic statuses, in alcoholics, in vegans, and once in a while in elderly or hospitalized patients. So yeah, like I said, deficiency is not that common. It is pretty well absorbed, but phytic acid does reduce absorption. In Egypt and Iran, there was a high amount of phytic acid in the bread that they were eating. And so even though they were getting zinc from their diet, the phytic acid was reducing their ability to absorb it. Calcium and zinc have the same charge. They both have this 2+ electrical charge, and so they compete for similar absorption, as well as copper and iron also have that 2+ charge. If you have too much zinc, it can interfere with copper metabolism, and that's why the upper limit was created for zinc, as well as you can experience some pretty nasty side effects and symptoms of zinc toxicity. And so it's recommended that people do not take megadose zinc supplements, especially without consulting with their doctor first. Okay, so what about the gut and bacteria and immunity? So this is actually partially wrong, and I should edit this. According to our book, this is true, but more and more studies are coming out and actually finding that there are some bacteria in the amniotic fluid, as well as the woman's reproductive tract, as well as in the infant at birth. So the infant isn't as sterile as they once believed the baby to be. However, this is true, is that most of the colonization of an infant occurs in the first few years of life. And this can depend on their diet, if they're breastfed, how they came into this world. Babies that were born via C-section have different microbiomes compared to babies that were born vaginally. And there's all sorts of variables. The bacteria are generally beneficial, and they help produce short-chain fatty acids. Bacteria can also help produce biotin and vitamin K. And bacteria can be very important, healthy bacteria, to fight off potentially opportunistic or harmful bacteria, such as Clostridium difficile or E. coli. All right, so if you want to find out which bacteria colonize your microbiome, you can actually take samples and send them off to a lab to be categorized. And there are multiple different companies that do this. You can look up one at this link, the Human Food Project. And there's another company called uBiome. And sometimes you can actually get this done for free. Other times it could cost up to $100. but it's quite interesting. They can give you health reports that go along with your microbiome kind of database, which might tell you your risk for certain diseases or your ability to digest and process certain foods versus others based on your microbiome. Good bacteria. So we do have some very helpful bacteria that can normally colonize our GI tract or be taken in probiotic form. And those include lactobacilli species and Saccharomyces. And these have significantly been able to reduce diarrhea, both acute and chronic diarrhea. There is a type of diarrhea that's very, very bad is an understatement, but very, very health altering. And this is a diarrhea caused by the bacterium C. difficile or Clostridium difficile. This commonly occurs in elderly, people who are hospitalized, people who are in nursing homes, people who may have a suppressed immune system. And it causes a very watery diarrhea in which the person becomes very dehydrated and loses a lot of electrolytes. It is antibiotic resistant to most antibiotics. Sometimes an IV antibiotic will work, but in that case, the person has to stay in the hospital to receive that antibiotic. One thing that is actually very effective in treating this, and it may sound surprising to you or maybe even disgusting to you, but it cures about 90% of this, is something called fecal transplants, where healthy donors can actually donate stool samples. Those stool samples are processed, put in a pill form, and then unhealthy people who are sick, can have that transplanted into them so that healthy donors' microbiome can recolonize the unhealthy person's microbiome. And it's proven to be actually very, very successful. You can even get paid to be a donor. So that could be potentially exciting for you. Other issues with immunity and disease and the microbiome. There's something called the hygiene hypothesis. And this kind of started maybe 15, 20 years ago when hand sanitizer became very popular. And everyone started sanitizing their hands, sanitizing surfaces, sanitizing everything. And what happened is this caused us to be exposed to less and less bacteria. And as we were not exposed to as many bacteria, our immune system actually kind of potentially got a little bit lazy and it was understimulated. And so now we're seeing things that wouldn't have potentially been issues in the past causing an immune response, like multiple proteins in food, bacteria that potentially aren't that harmful, or even the body's own organs and cells responding against itself, such as an autoimmune disease. And so actually, some big medical associations have stopped using these types of sanitizers and said that they are not an efficient way to help with this issue. There is a lot of evidence that certain disease is related to microbiome, and when they categorize the microbiome of people with these diseases, they see many similarities. For example, somebody with type 2 diabetes would have a very similar bacteria profile with another person who has type 2 diabetes. And there's thought that the bacteria actually could play a role in how we break down, absorb, metabolize foods, as well as even hormone secretion and weight. This is a section you can read on your own in the book about choosing a high quality probiotic. Oftentimes, one that is refrigerated tends to be higher quality. And you want to look for the number of colony forming units, or CFUs. It should be at least in the millions. You will also want to look for healthful species such as lactobacillus or bifidobacterium, or Saccharomyces. What we discussed today, so we discussed blood, anemia, the immune system, vitamin A, and probiotics, and all of their relations to our health and other vitamins and minerals. So I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. I know it was a little bit of a long one, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.